Hello and good evening. I'm Braddock District Supervisor James Walkinshaw. Thank you for joining our Braddock District Budget Town Hall. I know there are many questions surrounding the proposed fiscal year 2022 budget, and my hopes are to answer as many of them as we can tonight. In studio with me is Fairfax County's Chief Financial Officer Joe Mondoro, who will give an overview of the proposed FY 2022 budget and help answer questions. And joining us virtually is Braddock District School Board member Megan McLaughlin, who will help answer questions related to Fairfax County Public Schools. I thank them both for being here with me. As you may have heard, County Executive Brian Hill presented the proposed fiscal year 2022 budget on February 23rd. That proposal included a real estate tax rate of $1.14 per $100 of assessed value, a 1-cent reduction from the fiscal year 2021 rate. Since then, the Board of Supervisors voted to advertise the fiscal year 2022 real estate tax rate of $1.15 per $100 of assessed value, the same rate as FY 2021. It's important to note that this is not the final tax rate, but rather a ceiling that we cannot exceed. We face unique challenges this year. Rising home values have resulted in higher assessments, which place a burden on our homeowners, especially those with smaller homes. And these added costs are passed on to renters as well. Due to the pandemic, revenues from business licenses and taxes on commercial property, businesses, and hotel rooms have declined dramatically. As a result, the county executive's proposed tax rate reduction of $1.14 per $100 of assessed value would result in an average tax increase of $224. Our teachers, school support staff, and county employees have done incredible work under difficult circumstances throughout the pandemic. And unfortunately, the proposed budget does not include pay raises for these dedicated frontline workers. As I have throughout the process, I will continue listening to the thoughts and concerns of my constituents before the board adopts the final budget in May. I want to remind viewers who may want to sign up for the Braddock District's newsletter, the Braddock Beacon, to send us an email at braddock@fairfaxcounty.gov, and we'll send you a digital copy of the newsletter. You'll also receive new episodes of my Braddock Voices podcast, where I invite community leaders and subject matter experts to talk about issues important to the Braddock District. We have new guests every couple of weeks, and you don't want to miss it. You can also follow me on Facebook at Supervisor James Walkinshaw or Twitter at JR Walkinshaw to receive regular community updates. Tonight, you can submit your questions anytime during this program at 703-324-1114, or you can email the Braddock District Town Hall inbox at braddocktownhall@fairfaxcounty.gov. You can also comment in my Facebook Live comment section at Supervisor James Walkinshaw. I look forward to hearing from you. And right now, I want to turn to Braddock District School Board member Megan McLaughlin for any opening remarks she would like to make. Megan, thanks for joining us. I think you're muted.
How is that?
That's great. We hear you now. It wouldn't be a virtual meeting if there wasn't one muting incident.
That's right. And I was trying to make sure that no sounds were coming from my end during your introductions. So good evening to both of you and to the Braddock District who's joining us here this evening. It is a pleasure to continue serving as your Braddock District School Board member. I am now entering my 10th year on the school board. And so this is also my 10th budget. Certainly we have seen that many changes have happened in the fiscal climate here in Fairfax County. And so, James, I really appreciate you inviting me to join you. I will be happy to certainly provide answers in greater detail, but I do want to just let the audience know that our school board is very mindful of the economic climate and the fiscal forecast. The biggest difference in our proposal that we sent over to the Board of Supervisors was a significant ask of a 3% raise for school employees. And that was based on the surrounding school districts projecting to give 3 to 5% raises for their employees, along with the state government projecting to give their raises to employees. And so we know that all we can do is just present to you what the needs are for the school system. Other than that, the other large change to our budget over last year was about $13 million for healthcare, but the biggest chunk was the $73 million in employee compensation. So as you can see right there between those two changes alone, and some additional costs, which Joe can certainly speak to in detail, it's significant. And we're again wanting very much to present here tonight publicly the school board's commitment to partnering with the Board of Supervisors, with our county executive and superintendent, that we present what our needs are, but we're extremely mindful that the economic climate, regrettably, on the commercial side of things is where it is. And I do want to just note that because our school system was closed for at least the first semester to only virtual learning, we did see about a $21 million savings in our base savings for staffing changes. And so that piece is there, along with certainly, again, Joe is far more the financial expert, but a lot of the CARES Act funding that our federal government and the state and even our county has passed along to the schools has been significantly helpful to meeting our most essential needs. And our other priority will continue to be, coming out of COVID, how do we mitigate the learning loss, and then how do we provide those essential mental health supports for our students and our staff coming out of the pandemic. So again, thank you so much for allowing me to be here, and look forward to just being helpful if possible tonight.
Thank you, Megan. Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you for your partnership with me in the Braddock District. I will now turn to Fairfax County's Chief Financial Officer, Joe Mondoro, for the presentation on the proposed fiscal year 2022 budget. Joe?
Thank you, Supervisor Walkinshaw. I'm going to go through a fairly short presentation that is excerpted from the presentation that the County Executive gave to the Board of Supervisors on February 23rd. For folks who are watching or listening who are interested in seeing the larger presentation, hearing the presentation that the County Executive gave, or even better, going through the volumes of budget documents, they're all at the county website, fairfaxcounty.gov. Right on the front page, budget information is one of the choices you can make, and it'll take you to all that information. The presentation that I'm going to go through, again, is excerpted from the presentation that the County Executive gave, and I just want to go through some context, some intro information, and then dig into some of the details before we open it up for questions. On this first slide, we just lay out the fact that this budget, like last year's budget, because of where we are in the pandemic, is very conservative. There are some initiatives that are included consistent with the board priorities that the board's been focused on for the last number of years. But really, the investments are very modest. One of the things that I think has been a hallmark of the county's budget process during this last year, and I anticipate it'll continue in the coming months at least, is that we've been even more deliberate than we typically are relative to looking at the budget, identifying to the board and the community all of the changes that are materializing over the course of the year, whether it's changes in our revenues, additional resources from the federal government, which has been extremely helpful for us as we've navigated over the last year, and all of the responses that county staff have put in place to respond to the pandemic under the leadership of the board. In terms of some of the federal dollars that we received, and we've gotten a fairly significant amount of funding at this point, in excess of $400 million. What folks typically hear about is the $200 million in CARES funding that we received last April. We know that the latest round of federal support for the county will total about $224 million. We'll get about half of that within 60 days of the adoption of the federal act, and then the remaining part no earlier than 12 months after that. And so that funding will inform the discussions that the board will be having in the coming months and probably years relative to our continued response to the pandemic, as well as our pivot to recovery. So we'll talk a little bit more of that as we go forward. In terms of the relatively modest investments that are included in this county executive budget for fiscal 22, we have, like we did last year, presented them in the context of the strategic plan priority areas. The strategic plan is being worked on as we continue through this budget process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. But if we go to the next slide, slide 3, I'll just lay some of the framework for the 22 budget. First of all, as I always say at these meetings, the conversation that we typically have is really focused on the general fund. That's where a lot of the programs that folks are interested in relative to education, public safety, et cetera, are funded. It's where the revenue supported by the real estate tax flow. But it really is just a part of the overall budget. For fiscal 22, it's just under $5 billion, but the total county budget is closer to $9 billion, and that includes other funding streams such as wastewater, solid waste, et cetera. But really what we're going to focus on tonight, unless we get some questions on some of the other categories, is the general fund. As Supervisor Walkinshaw indicated, the county executive's budget is balanced with a reduction in the real estate tax rate from $1.15 to $1.14. It's important to note, and everybody who's, not everybody, but most everybody who's received their real estate assessment at this point recognizes this. The impact of real estate on homeowners and businesses is not just the rate, but also the assessed value. And we'll talk in some more detail as we go through the presentation. But in some ways, surprisingly, during this time, assessments for residential properties are increasing fairly healthily in this budget. And the impact of that is an increased tax burden on our homeowners in many cases. And we'll talk about that again as we go through. In terms of the high level of the budget, the revenue that's generated, the new revenue that's generated in the budget, supports just under 0.6% growth in the county budget. The revenue is actually about 1.5%, but we have a recommendation to include a reserve because we are still in the middle of a pandemic, and we'll talk about that as well. And so the growth in expenditures is, again, 0.6%, so very modest. In that increase, we do have a recommendation for an operating budget increase for schools of $14 million. But as School Board Member McLaughlin indicated, that does not meet the school board request because of the issue of primarily teacher and other school staff funding. The request from the school board is $104 million, so we have about a $90 million delta at this point, and again, we'll talk about that in some more detail. As Supervisor Walkinshaw indicated, the county's budget does not include pay increases for fiscal year 22, and just to put that in some context, to fully fund our pay increase package would be about $55 million. So in the context of these very constrained revenues, that just wasn't possible. I'm not going to go over this list on the bottom of page 3 because I'm going to talk about it when we get further into the presentation. So if we want to go to the next slide, page 4, we'll talk really quickly about the strategic plan. And essentially, we've reworked the process that was originally anticipated for the strategic plan, which was to have the communication and the discussion in the community occur in parallel to the budget conversation, with the board hopefully adopting the strategic plan at the same time as the budget. Based on board feedback and a discussion we had at our last budget committee, that schedule has been changed, and we're going to provide more time for discussion in the community, discussion with board members, contemplation about the strategic plan, with an anticipated discussion about adoption in the fall. I would anticipate that because of how closely aligned the priority areas that the strategic plan identified are to the priority areas that we've been talking about for really years, the budget guidance and the other types of direction that the board gives county staff as we go through this budget process will very much reflect the strategic plan, but it won't be at that point an adopted document. And so a lot more to come on the strategic plan as we go through the coming months. There will be probably virtual, but opportunities for conversation, discussion, and input from the community on the strategic plan as we move into the next phase of its development. On the next slide, we just have some high-level summary information about those general fund revenues that I mentioned before. You can see over this time period, there's some fluctuation from year to year in terms of the growth rate. During this period, though, in every year, except for fiscal 21, there was growth in revenues. The blue bars or green bars, depending on what it looks like on the screen to you, reflect that sort of traditional revenue picture for the categories that drive the general fund. The overlay of those orange bars reflects what that inflow of federal dollars that we've talked about, especially in terms of the CARES funding, has meant to general fund revenues, just to demonstrate the significance of those during this time in terms of moving really important initiatives relative to providing basic support for our community, providing funding for small businesses that are being stressed by this dynamic, providing the ability for county facilities, school facilities to be equipped with PPE and all of the types of infrastructure that's necessary to perform our tasks in this pandemic environment. I would mention, in terms of the last bar chart on slide 5, that 2.7% growth rate for next year, and we say this every year, but we really mean it this year, is very preliminary and is going to change. The dynamic of revenues at this point is so much in flux that this was a point-in-time estimate, but it will change over the course of the coming year as we move ultimately into 2023 next year. On the next slide, we've got a little bit more detail about general fund revenue, looking at the real estate tax, which is about 70% of the general fund, and so a very significant portion of the equation, and one, as I said, which impacts the taxpayer not only based on the rate that's ultimately adopted by the board, but also on assessed values. And this chart shows assessed value changes. If you look at the 22 column, you can see that overall assessed values are going up. What's relatively healthy, almost 3%. However, there's a huge dichotomy here in terms of the fact that residential properties are growing by over 4%, and commercial properties are declining by about 4%. Just a quick conversation about that. In terms of residential properties, while in many ways I think it is surprising that values are increasing, the dynamic of the market is what's driving that. During this last year, and so the assessment valuation process takes into account the data of the last calendar year, January 1 through December 30th of last year, the sales in the community, driven by very low interest rates, very high demand, relatively low inventory, saw houses selling very quickly and prices increasing pretty significantly. Overall, on average in the county, sales prices were up over 8% from last year. What that data translates into in terms of assessments is our tax admin staff take a look, neighborhood by neighborhood, at that sales data and identify what that data means in terms of the value of your home. That said, the process of assessments is some art as well as the science of that math. And for those communities, for example, that have had relatively few number of sales, those communities, and we have a growing number of them in the county, that are not the homogeneous communities that were originally constructed by the developer maybe 40 or 50 years ago with 2 or 3 models of Rambler and Cape Cod. They're a combination of those original homes, many of them with additions, and teardowns of completely new homes. And so the analysis that's done relative to those assessed values is complicated. Again, everybody has received their assessed value in the mail. If you're interested in looking at some of the detail behind the assessment, you can go onto the website, again, fairfaxcounty.gov. Again, right in the middle of the page, assessed value information is one of the choices. You can input your address, and you can see the neighborhood sales that are driving the value change for your home. And sorry, one more thing. If you disagree, because again, there's that art component of the assessment process. If you disagree, please reach out to DTA and talk to the staff about what you think is not taken into account relative to your value. On the commercial side, it's a really different dynamic. Number one, commercial properties don't turn over nearly as quickly as residential properties. And the reality of a commercial property is it is there to generate revenue for its owners. And so what staff looks at are data relative to transactions if they occur, but also rents that are being charged, vacancy rates, et cetera. And especially in those categories of commercial businesses that were the most dramatically impacted by the pandemic, like hotels, like retail establishments, like restaurants, those values are coming down pretty significantly, double digit in many cases, as much as 45% for hotels, because the business of those businesses is so much below prior year levels. So again, the overall increase for residential is over 4%, decrease for commercial is 4%. When we talk about the residential values, we talk often about the average residential property. And just again, as we say every year at these meetings, there really is no average residential property. It's the aggregate of all the data of all of the 300,000 properties in the county. And so the impact on your individual tax bill is the change in value for your home and that overall rate that the board will ultimately adopt in May. As we shift to the next slide, just wanted to talk a little bit about the overall general fund budget, starting with revenues that we talked about a little bit already, and identifying the fact that we have really a relatively small amount of money that we're talking about in terms of additional resources, about $43 million. When we back out the $20 million in reserve that I mentioned, and I'll talk about a little bit more, we've got $22 million in revenues that are available for new expenditures, and that gets to that 0.6% that I mentioned. Talk a little bit first about schools, and then I'll go into the county side. As we've mentioned, the school operating increase is about $14 million. On this slide, you see a $13 million number because that reflects the combination of that increase and a slight decrease in school debt service because of the benefits of our most recent bond sale, which we were able to sell at historically low rates, and therefore the increase in debt service for those new bonds, which was relatively inexpensive, is more than offset by the decrease in debt service for bonds that are being retired after 20 years of being out there. And so the combination of those two items gets to the $13 million. But when we're looking at the operating fund, that delta of $90 million between the request from the school board and the recommendation in the county executive's budget, which again is just a recommendation at this point and is the prompter for these conversations and the board's ultimate deliberation, is largely, as Mrs. McLaughlin said, the result of the interest in being able to access the state revenues for pay increases and provide those to teachers and other school staff. The challenge in terms of the Fairfax budget and some other budgets in the state, although in most other jurisdictions the delta is significantly lower, the challenge is that in order to access that state money, local dollars, almost 4 times as many local dollars, need to be generated in order to meet the requirements of that state funding. And so that's sort of the dynamic that we're operating in right now relative to the schools conversation. There certainly is work being done, advocacy being done by both the school board and the board of supervisors to try to change that dynamic relative to the flow of state dollars, to be able to access those dollars and maybe provide them as a bonus or maybe not provide them in the way the state originally intended. But the framework of the state budget is really the driver for this delta right now. On the county side, I'm going to start with a couple of the categories that really go beyond the priority areas and then go into the priority areas. And I won't go through every single one of these, but just to give a flavor of the budget. On the county side, we have county compensation. And as you've heard now a couple times, there are no pay increases recommended for county employees. However, you see that this is a reduction, not just a flat number. And that's because county compensation includes benefits as well. And we are in, I guess, now the third year of a cycle wherein it's primarily driven by health insurance, but wherein our benefits costs are actually decreasing from year to year. At a high level, the reason for that is that we have been, over a number of years, migrating from what essentially are more expensive, traditional copay kind of insurance plans to coinsurance. The result of the structure of those plans is that typically there are savings both for the employer and the employee. We had significant, based on the closure of our last copay plan, migration out of that more expensive plan and therefore savings. In addition, the other big factor for benefits is retirement. And while we did have a recommendation for increasing retirement rates because our retirement systems did not generate the returns last year that were necessary in order to maintain the current rates, we have a pretty significant reduction in our base salaries that are driven by those rates. So it's a similar dynamic to the real estate tax where you've got the assessments and the rate, and that impacts the amount that is paid. For retirement, you have the base salary and the rate, and when those base salary dollars are impacted, as they are during this time, we've got a much smaller increase in retirement than we would have otherwise. In terms of some of the priority areas, safety and security, health and environment, et cetera, I'll just give you some high-level information about what's included in those categories. And again, we can talk through relative to questions, or if you're interested in going into the details, again, online, we've got all of those details. Safety and security is pretty self-explanatory. It's largely our public safety kinds of programs. We have a number of initiatives here, which include putting into the baseline budget some decisions that the board had made previously. For example, body-worn cameras was a decision that the board made last carryover. It's funded in the current year budget as a result of that action. But because it was after the adopted budget for fiscal 21, it needs to be put in the 22 budget in the baseline. And so that's an increase here. We also have a couple of new facilities that are coming online as the county continues to grow. We've got needs for both police and fire stations. The fire station that will be coming online during the fiscal year, so we've got partial year funding for the staff there, is in Tyson's, just inside the Beltway, as the number of residents and businesses continue to increase in that fire district. And then a new police station in South County, just off of 123 near the Workhouse Arts Foundation. We have a new fire station, the first one in a number of years, which will have a significant impact in that area in terms of response time for police officers, but will also impact the rest of the county, because part of what's going to be done when that station opens is that the boundaries of the other district stations will be redrawn, shrunk essentially, and so response time should improve everywhere. So that's a positive overall. What we've been doing for the last, 4 years is funding in increments the tranches of police officers that are necessary for that station to open on time when it's constructed, because as you can imagine, it takes a fair amount of time to recruit and train and get police officers on the street. So the recommendation for fiscal 22 is the last tranche of those police officers who will staff that station. In terms of health and environment, a couple of the items that I've included here are also ones that have actually been started this fiscal year as a result of the need, for example, to address contact tracing and other responses to the vaccine, to the pandemic, including vaccinations. The board added public health nurses as part of our carryover review, funded by some of those federal dollars, and that has decided that we want to make those permanent. And so we've got funding in the baseline budget to make those permanent so that they'll continue to support pandemic response in the short term, but ultimately will provide much needed support in schools for working down the ratio of kids to public health nurses that has been a challenge in recent years. There are also some modest, I will say, but some environmental initiatives funded in this budget, while They are modest. We have been fairly successful. We need to do more, but we've been fairly successful funding the environmental initiatives that are currently underway at quarterly reviews, recognizing that in many cases we need to just keep moving with the investment in infrastructure, changing streetlights from old technology to new, more efficient technology, changing the lighting in county facilities in the same way. And so we've been adding funding in addition to the adopted process at our quarterly reviews. The last thing I'll say about health and environment is it, again, is one of those priority areas that I talked about in terms of the strategic plan. It was one that folks wrestled with in terms of, did it make sense that that was a single priority area? The way the conversations ended in late 2019 was that, yes, it made sense. I'm going to guess that as we go back to the community and have conversations this year after the pandemic experiences that we've had, the outcome may be different. And so we may see a little bit different phrasing of that priority area, perhaps pulling it into two. I think I'm going to jump down to the bottom of this chart and just indicate that in addition to the fact that there is about $12 million in additional revenue for the general fund for the county, part of the reason that these investments were able to be made was that we took some reductions in county agencies. And part of those reductions are what drove that reduction in retirement that I mentioned before. We also, as I've said now a couple times, have that reserve of $20 million identified in the 22 budget. We had a slightly smaller reserve in the 21 budget, and we added to that over the course of the year. One of the things, again, that I think has held us in good stead is recognizing that as information changes, as new information becomes available, we need to respond to it. And the dynamic during the pandemic has been that information has been changing very dramatically and rapidly. And so we have taken advantage of that reserve in a number of ways, one of which is as we get to the point where we can say, okay, transient occupancy taxes, and Supervisor Walkinshaw talked about this in his opening, which are those taxes that you pay when you stay in a hotel, are down dramatically. And so we've had to take those estimates down as a result. School-age child care fees, because the SAC program, the school-age child care program, has not operated as it typically does because kids have not been in school for most of the school year. And so as we've gotten to the various quarterly reviews, we've taken down those revenue estimates, and the reserve has been the way we've been able to do that without negatively impacting in the short-term programs. And so that approach has worked for us this year, and we're anticipating it'll be necessary in the future year. One thing that I would say is staff was very clear, the county executive was very clear, that it's intended that this reserve be considered by the board for both county and schools needs as we go through fiscal year 22. We want to go to the next slide. Just looking forward, anticipating that the challenges in the budget are going to continue and that the information is going to continue to change. For example, when we put this budget together, we hadn't even started to receive business professional occupational license taxes, one which we anticipate would be pretty dramatically impacted by the pandemic. They are filed March 1st. They are flowing now to the county, and by the end of the month, which is pretty close, we should have an estimate that will inform any changes that we feel are appropriate to give the board in a couple of weeks when we give them what we call our add-on package, which is the county executive's opportunity to make some changes to the budget that was ultimately put together in January. In addition, I think it's important just to set the stage for the next budget year. And again, while that 2.7% revenue growth is going to change, we are anticipating some improvement, but we also recognize that there's a long list of priorities in terms of affordable housing, the environment, employee pay, the transition to collective bargaining, that potentially will need to be addressed in the 23 budget. So I think it will be a challenging one as we move, hopefully, back to a more normal budget dynamic. The next slide, we just have a little bit of information about how to provide input for this process. As we said now a couple of times, the process gets kicked off when the county executive releases his budget at the end of February, and the conversation ensues in the community. As part of that conversation, we have meetings like this. We have the public hearings, which will occur on April 13th, 14th, and 15th. We have the opportunity to send in comments that you have, either to your individual board member or to the entire board, and the email address and phone numbers are here for that, as well as for signing up for the public hearing. The public hearings this year, like last year, will be virtual. So we'll have the opportunity for individuals who are interested in testifying to either send in videos in advance or to call in the day that they have been signed up for speaking. Finally, just really quickly, in terms of the budget timeline, we're about smack dab in the middle of the 2 months of really intense conversation in the community. We have a budget committee meeting next Tuesday. We'll talk about the third quarter review that the board just received last week. We'll talk about the Human Services Council recommendations relative to the budget. And then the following week, we'll turn to public hearings, so that by the end of April, we'll have, the board will have their decisions made in terms of what the budget for 22 will look like. They'll provide to staff and the community their guidance for 23. And we'll then turn everything over to the schools, and they'll restart their intensive public discussion, knowing at that point what the state budget is and what the county budget is. And ultimately will make their decisions so that we can both start our fiscal year with balanced budgets on July 1. So with that, I'll stop talking and we can take some questions.
All right, thank you for the great presentation, Joe. And with that, we're going to open the time up to you, the viewers, so we can answer your questions live. Again, you can submit your questions by calling 703-324-1114 or emailing braddocktownhall@fairfaxcounty.gov or posting your question on Facebook at Supervisor James Walkinshaw. I also have some questions that came in advance, and I'll be reading those out from folks that emailed them in. But I understand we have a telephone call. It sounds like we have Carrie from North Springfield. Carrie, go ahead. You're live.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe Montoya, James Walkinshaw, Megan McLaughlin, for the dedicated public citizen service that you do for our district and county. And thanks to your families for the sacrifices you all make to serve. Joe, I'm looking at the capital improvement program, the infrastructure replacements and upgrades on page 166, and I'm looking at the HVAC, the heating and cooling systems, and the roof replacements that are planned there. My question is two-part. Have you looked at and considered geothermal heating and cooling systems and costed that out? We installed geothermal heating and cooling in our home 11 years ago, and we cut our energy use by 2/3, and that means we cut our cost by 2/3. So, and then on the roof replacements, have you looked at the solar roof technology now that has been around about 4 years? I would suggest to you that this is where taxpayers would save the most over the long term with the wisest infrastructure investment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Campbell. Yeah, in terms of, let me do the easier one first, which is in terms of solar. Not only are we, as we replace roofs, looking at the opportunity for solar, but we have a partnership that has now been signed, sealed, and delivered in terms of the procurement process for vendors to come in and look at those existing roofs where it makes sense, roofs that are new enough and have the infrastructure, the supports that are sufficient enough to have solar retrofitted to them. That includes school facilities, which, as you can imagine, is a much larger inventory of rooftops, and it includes potentially the opportunity to put solar canopies up in parking lots and elsewhere to also make some significant strides in terms of accessing the benefits of solar power. In terms of the HVAC infrastructure, we are definitely, with every new building and with every, to your point about the infrastructure renewal, the replacement of existing infrastructure in existing buildings that are not being completely renovated, looking at the most energy efficient technologies that are available. The board has been very clear, for example, as we look at new buildings, about the need to focus on overall the environmental footprint of those buildings from a LEED perspective, and certainly the HVAC infrastructure is a major part of that.
And Joe knows that this has been a priority for me to make sure that as we're planning those projects and new buildings that we're not unwittingly committing ourselves to decades of greenhouse gas emissions by installing something that might seem pretty outdated 5 or 10 years from now. And I think on solar, Joe did a great job of explaining our solar PPA program, which is very exciting. A partnership with our schools, and Megan McLaughlin, who's here with us, was a big part of making that happen. I think Carrie was asking maybe a specific question about actually solar roofs as opposed to solar panels on roofs, and I don't know that technology is ready to be deployed to the type of roofs that we have. I know that it is available for residential homes, but that's something that certainly perhaps our partners could look at. I'm going to go to a question that came in advance, and this one is a schools question, and we still have Megan here with us, so we'll let her jump in. Anne sent us an email in advance and asked the following question. Apparently, Fairfax County Public Schools enrollment has declined by 9,300 students from a year ago. Why is the FCPS budget increasing rather than decreasing? Second part of the question. What is the relationship between two of the county's teachers' unions, Fairfax County Federation of Teachers and the Fairfax Education Association, and Superintendent Brabrand, the school board, and the Board of Supervisors? To what extent do these unions affect Fairfax County policies and budget? What lobbying entities are available to Fairfax County students, parents, and guardians? Before we go to Megan, because the Board of Supervisors was referenced here, the relationship between the Fairfax County Federation of Teachers and the Fairfax Education Association is like the relationship between literally dozens and dozens of groups in the county and the Board of Supervisors. So they provide valued input. I can tell you from my perspective, I value very much their input, representing hundreds or thousands of teachers who are members of those groups. But I hear from a lot of groups. And in terms of lobbying entities available to Fairfax County students, parents, and guardians, like I said, a lot of groups out there. From my perspective, I'm an open door. So people can always email me, Braddock at fairfaxcounty.gov, with thoughts or concerns that you have about the county or the school. So you don't need a lobbying entity to talk to me. You can contact me directly, and I know Megan takes the same approach. Megan, anything you want to add to that? And I think you're muted.
Here we go again. I appreciate Anne's questions. They're important ones. So let me try to do this as quickly as I can. First, we do have fewer students, well over 9,000 from the year prior. This is a trend we've seen both within the state and the nation. And as a result, local, state, and federal agencies have all agreed that for our nation's public school system, the goal was to hold the budgets harmless going into the next year, with the anticipation that the families will be re-enrolling their students as we open up our buildings and open up to in-person learning and get past the pandemic. Quite frankly, even when we reopened our buildings, about 50% of our students and families said they were not ready to take that step with their children, and they kept them home. But I do want to also point out that one of the trends we saw was a much more significant drop in our kindergarten enrollment. And so that also stands to reason for many parents. The idea of virtual learning for a kindergartner is just really not optimal for learning, particularly of a student moving out of preschool and coming in. So that was where we saw one of our most significant drops. But I do want to say to Anne and all families listening, as anyone who's followed this, they know I've been so proactive in following the science and reopening our schools to in-person learning as much as possible. I continue right up till today, really championing that we can increase in-person learning coming back for our fourth quarter when spring break ends next Monday. As many know, the CDC did provide additional guidance to reduce the spacing between students from 6 feet to 3 feet. And many of us on the board have been working with the superintendent, even though everyone else is on spring break, to really get plans in place to increase that. So I'm encouraged that I think we'll get some good news from the superintendent soon on that particular piece. About the teacher associations, James, I appreciate you capturing that very well. Certainly want to reassure all listeners that, first of all, Virginia is unique to other jurisdictions around the country. We are a right to work state. And so we don't have formal unions the way you might hear other public systems around the country. So there's no formal negotiations and compensation conversations in the same manner that people normally think about. And of our 28,000 full-time employees, the numbers are roughly similar. Between 7,000 and 10,000 employees might belong to one of our associations, our employee associations. So they don't have an undue influence. I know that's been a local, state, and a national narrative. They are valuable stakeholders, but so is everybody listening in on this town hall, and the million people who live in Fairfax County. And I'm so grateful to partner with James, because I know you absolutely share this very important commitment that every single resident, every single voice matters. And I'm proud of the data-driven decisions, James, that both you and I continue to focus on. That, I hope, gives confidence to our residents, because we're here to serve you. So thanks.
Thank you, Megan. And we have a question that has come in by email, and we have Brian Garcia here from my office is going to give us a question that's come in by email. Brian?
All right, so this question comes in from Dan, and it has to do with resources to make Roberts Road bikeable and walkable. And Dan asks, when will the county allocate and utilize funds to complete a safe connection for pedestrians and bikers along this unpaved portion of the Roberts Road commuting route beside Robinson Secondary School? So pretty hyper-local question there.
Can you just repeat it for me one more time?
Of course. So he asks, when will the county allocate and utilize funds to complete a safe connection for pedestrians and bikers along this unpaved portion of the Roberts Road commuting route beside Robinson Secondary School?
Unpaved portion of Roberts Road. He must mean the sidewalk, or missing sidewalk, or... Well, let me just talk, I can talk in general about, obviously we have across the county areas that are missing sidewalks, areas where we need crosswalks, areas where we need safer pedestrian and bicycle facilities. And one of our challenges is that in Fairfax County, the county doesn't control or own the road. So when you go to fill up your car and pay the gas tax, that money goes to Richmond, and they have responsibility for maintaining roads and a lot of pedestrian facilities across the county. And the reality is that in terms of funding and financing, they've fallen way short of where they need to be. Over the years, the county has, in a very significant way, supplemented VDOT's funding and made a lot of pedestrian and bicycle improvements across the county out of local tax dollars. But the truth is, you saw the budget numbers from Joe, we don't have the funds to do all of them. In terms of this specific connection, if you haven't already, please reach out to our office and give us the details, and we can talk to the Fairfax County Department of Transportation and see if we can work with VDOT to find a solution there. Joe, anything you want to add in terms of what the county has done for funding of pedestrian improvements?
I would just emphasize what you said relative to the fact that in the void of pretty insignificant funds flowing from the state at various points over the last number of years, the board has directed that both general fund resources and bond funds be put in place for these connections, but certainly they are not fully funded in any way.
And I'm going to go to a question that came in advance. Charles emailed us with the following question. Can you please lower the real estate tax rate of $1.15 to $1.10 per $100 of assessed value? We've been hit with massive property tax increases since 2013, including at the start of the pandemic in 2020. Can the board come up with a way to spend less money so that we can keep more of the money we work for? And Charles, I would love to say yes, we can do that we can get from $1.15 to $1.10, but I have to be honest with you and tell you that that is probably not realistic this year or anytime in the near future. To go from $1.15 to $1.10, as Joe's presentation outlined, each penny on the real estate tax rate represents about $27 million. So the reduction that you've outlined here would be a $130 million revenue cut. You saw on Joe's chart, there was a small list of increases, $1 million here, $2 million here, $11 million for police and firefighter new stations. But the largest line item on Joe's chart of changes this year was actually agency reductions and cost savings cuts, cost cuts. So our staff, our team, and the board scrub the budget every single year. And unfortunately, there are not $130 million of cuts without seriously getting into salary and benefits for our employees. And we've already talked about the fact that this proposal does not include a pay raise for them when some other jurisdictions are considering a pay raise, or serious cuts to the services that our community, I think, has come to expect in terms of high-quality parks. We just had a question about pedestrian improvements and a financial commitment there. So I do not think we can find that level of savings, Charles. We have another question that's come in by email. And Brian, you want to give us the email question?
Yep, so this one comes in from Emily, and it's also a Fairfax County Public Schools question. So Emily is a Fairfax County Public Schools teacher, and Emily is curious why. So the Fairfax County Public School Board has requested funding for a 3% compensation increase for their staff. Emily would like to know, what are you doing to fund this increase so that we can remain competitive with neighboring school systems and retain our premier workforce?
Yeah, well, Emily, thank you for your question, and thank you for your work as a teacher, especially over the last year. It's hard to think of any group that has had bigger challenges than our teachers and parents, students and families this year, and I know it hasn't been easy, so thank you for what you're doing. In terms of funding the 3% pay raise, Joe outlined some of the challenges, and you may have heard from the General Assembly an announcement that they passed a 5% pay raise for teachers across Virginia. And unfortunately, in Fairfax County, that's just not true. Because of the way that the state funds, or quite frankly doesn't fund, our schools, what they have called a 5% pay raise for teachers is really only a down payment on a pay raise. And I think Joe had the numbers that for that state-funded pay raise, the state commitment would be $9 million, so a 2% pay raise.
Yeah, for every 1% is about $5 million, and the county requirement is about $20 million.
$20 million. So you can see that the county has to come up with 4 times the amount that the state has come up with. And our challenge this year, as we've heard from the presentation and the questioners, is our revenue sources from all business taxes and commercial revenues are way down. So the question for us is, how much further do we go asking homeowners to pay to fund all of the things that we want to fund, including a pay raise for our teachers? And the average property tax increase based on the $1.14 rate was $224. If we were to go higher, that average increase would be higher, obviously. But importantly, many of our neighborhoods and individuals have seen assessment increases much higher than that $224 net tax increase. Some neighborhoods are looking at tax increases of $600, $700, $700 or $1,000 per home. And we're in a very difficult position asking them to do more. What we are trying to do, as Joe noted, is get flexibility from the state, asking them to waive the matching requirement, so the money that they've already budgeted for teacher pay raise give that to our schools, and we can use that to start the process of giving our teachers and school support staff the pay rate, and county employees the pay raises that they deserve. Megan, anything to add on that? I think that question was more directed at me, but anything you'd like to add?
Yes, just that I want to also thank Emily and all of her colleagues for the incredible work they've been doing this year. And I know that while James and I can speak on behalf of our boards and our appreciation, we're also very mindful for our hardworking employees that words of appreciation are not the type of actions that necessarily speak to your understanding of how we can remain competitive and continue to attract and retain the best teachers and school staff, as well as the best county employees as well. But everything that James said is what is such a challenge for us compared to Loudoun County, Prince William County, and even Arlington. The impacts of our commercial revenue loss is substantial. The impact of the fact that the state gives so fewer funding to Fairfax County compared to Prince William and Loudoun, and what is known as the local composite index formula. We just continue to get hit very hard with not getting the same amount of state matching funds. And so one of the things that in my time on the board, I really appreciate the Board of Supervisors have really embraced the One Fairfax mindset when we're talking about employee compensation. Whether you work for the county government or you work for the school system, we really want to make sure that our employees who are working very hard on behalf of residents do remain competitive within the region, and also will be able to have those raises that they might see happen on one side or the other. So I am hopeful that as the Board of Supervisors really take the hard look at where our revenue is, they hear the input from the public, that whatever we end up doing, whether it's getting some money from the state, how we can then ensure that whether if you work for the county government or if you work for the school system, we're going to do our very best to remain competitive with compensation in the region, but do understand that the other jurisdictions that I mentioned do not have the same fiscal forecast that we do, and that makes this year in particular a great challenge. But please do know we value our employees and we're doing everything we can. But as James also noted, we're already hearing from our residents, because of the residential revenue being such a buffer to what happened commercially, there are limits there. Thanks, James.
It's a really important point that Megan raised about the different challenge we're facing this year vis-a-vis our neighbors in the region. Loudoun and Prince William being the most comparable just in terms of size, but Joe can probably expand upon this, but they have much different revenue mixes than we do. One, they each have very little commercial revenue. There's no Tysons in Loudoun. There's no Tysons in Prince William. There's no Reston in Loudoun. There's no Reston in Prince William. Their commercial sources are growing, but they have very little. And what they do have comes from data centers. They both have made a huge effort over the years to attract data centers, which don't create a huge number of jobs, but obviously they're still up and running.
That's right.
They don't have vacancies in data centers right now, so they haven't seen the decline in commercial revenue sources that we have, and that's creating the situation we're in, where they're able to look at doing some things this year that are a much bigger challenge for us. Joe, anything to add on that?
That's exactly right, and I think the dynamic there are typically differences jurisdiction to jurisdiction relative to especially the real estate market, but obviously the other categories as well. Some years it's closer in versus farther out, and that can go both ways. This year it seems like those differences are even more significant and stark. For example, as you said, Loudoun has a very significant budget increase driven entirely by data center valuations. Arlington, which we haven't mentioned so far, which does have actually a very strong commercial base, a much higher number of commercial properties than us, but is seeing really significant value increases in residential. And so, again, in every jurisdiction, there's a little bit of a different dynamic going on. I would just make two other quick comments relative to the question. The first is the last two questions, I think, put in very clear terms the challenge that the board has every year in balancing the budget and coming to a balance in the budget. The differential between the two advocacies is more than $200 million in terms of impact on the revenue side versus impact on the expenditure side, just in terms of those two issues. And then the last thing I would say is that certainly as the conversation about the budget for both fiscal 22 and the current budget year unfolds, one of the dynamics that's on the table, especially as we work through the potential of another year with no baseline increases in pay, is the prospect for bonuses. The board had directed that staff identify opportunities for bonuses this fiscal year, and in the third quarter package that the board received last week and that we'll talk about in committee next Tuesday, there is funding that's been identified that could be used by the board for bonuses for employees.
And I want to go back to an issue that you raised in your presentation, Joe, and that is the influx of federal dollars that we have seen and expect to see, first from the CARES Act and now from the American Rescue Plan. And some people listening or watching might hear that and say, wow, I mean, the county is clearly flush with cash. They've had a huge amount of federal dollars come in. Why can't they cut taxes? Why can't they fund pay raises for teachers? And the answer is that, first, starting with the CARES Act, there were very specific restrictions in terms of how that money could be used. It could only be used for items that were directly responding to the pandemic. So the vaccination efforts that you've seen, the hiring of hundreds of contact tracers, support to small businesses who were going to go out of business if they didn't receive grants from that funding. All of those efforts constituted and continue to constitute our use of the CARES Act. So we couldn't use it for tax increases. We couldn't use it to give a pay raise to teachers or county employees. The American Rescue Plan is less restricted, but still has some restrictions. It can be used to respond to the pandemic, and it can't be used to cut taxes. And from a fiscal planning perspective, we have to be very cautious about utilizing those funds, even in a roundabout way, to raise pay, because it's one-time money. So we're going to have it, one tranche of it this year and one tranche of it next year. But if we were to build it into our baseline budget, when it runs out, we'd have to pay the piper a couple of years from now. Anything to add to that in terms of restrictions on those two?
Yeah, just two quick things. The first is that relative to pay, absolutely, we would not want to build that into base pay. And in fact, clearly in the guidance for the CARES Act, there were prohibitions to that. You could use it, and we did, for hazard pay bonuses that were just that, bonuses, one time, did not build into the base. In terms of the latest round, certainly not all of the guidance has been promulgated, and we would anticipate that it's going to take a little bit of time for that to happen. But there is language relative to the term this time is premium pay. But again, it is designed to meet a specific short-term increase and not be built into baseline salaries.
Okay. I've got some more questions that came in advance, and I will try to speed up because I've gotten about 5 more, and we have about 25 minutes. Robert wrote, I'm concerned about the amount of debt the county has accrued, especially in light of increased unemployment during the pandemic. How does the board plan to address these challenges? Are taxes going to be raised? Are we taking on more debt, or will programs be cut from the budget? And Joe can give a detailed answer on this, but it's important to note that Fairfax County's budget is balanced every year. Unlike the federal government, we cannot run an annual operating deficit. We do issue bonds to fund long-term capital improvement projects, and we do that in a very prudent, responsible way based on a series of guidelines, and we've done it in a way that bond rating agencies have year after year after year supported and approved of and cited by giving us AAA bond ratings. Joe, anything to add on that in terms of our debt capacity and posture?
Yeah, I think that was perfect. I would just say two quick things. One is that the rationale behind the use of debt for the construction of a capital facility, a rec center, or a school, is that the lifespan of that facility, decades, makes sense to be supported by future users as well as the users who are going to enter the doors when it opens. And so spreading out that cost over decades, as we do, 20 years, is a rational way to deal with that. And I would just add emphasis to the point you already made that we do not issue debt for anything other than those capital projects. It is for facilities that have a lifespan, and they're typically well over the 20 years of the life of the debt. They are not to fund operations.
And a good example of that that's important to us in the Braddock District is the upcoming dredging of Lake Accoting, which will be funded by debt. It's a state revolving fund that we'll be utilizing. We expect the cost to be about $30 million. And what is the interest rate that we're looking at on that?
I knew you were going to ask that, and I believe it is in the 1.25% range.
So very low interest rate. If you can get that on a mortgage refinance, that would be great for you. But to Joe's point, that is a facility, the lake, that people will be enjoying 30 years from now. So we'll be paying for it slowly over time, but it's within the confines of our debt guidelines, and certainly within our confines to repay that debt over time. Two questions that I think are kind of related here, so I will ask them together. Gina writes, even though the tax rate is the same as last year, the real estate assessments have gone up significantly. Mine went up 16% from last year to this year and will cost me an additional $1,000. That's the highest I've heard, Gina, and I would recommend you take Joe's advice to go on the website and check out the assessment data for your neighborhood and make sure that no mistake was made, and we can help you with that if you need help. But you go on to point out it's unfair to evaluate real estate taxes this way. Just because homes in your area have increased in value, you shouldn't have to continually pay taxes for the many more years you'll be in your home. The increased sales price is good if you're moving, but if you like your neighborhood and want to stay in Fairfax, you are being penalized and forced to consider moving out of Fairfax. And let me just say to Gina, I agree with you completely. I think that the real estate tax is one of the worst ways that we could fund a government. Unfortunately, it is the tool that the Commonwealth of Virginia gives us. So if you go to other states, local governments will be financed by a host of different revenue sources and mechanisms. Here in Virginia, we're very limited in terms of the taxes that we can impose. And you highlighted perfectly the challenge with the real estate tax. It hits people on a fixed income hardest. Just because your home value went up doesn't mean you have more money in your pocket each payday or at the first of each month. So it is a very problematic way to fund a government. The next questioner, Margaret, says that in 2020, the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors gained authorization from Virginia to institute a meals tax of up to 4 cents on the dollar on top of the existing 6.5% sales tax. This will be allowed next year with no voter referendum required. Please explain your position and plans on this issue. When do you want this new tax to be implemented? What's the amount of tax? What food items circumstances would be subject? What are the benefits to the county budget? Are there any plans for a cost-benefit study to update the one done in 2016? So Gina highlighted the challenge of the real estate tax and our over-reliance on the real estate tax. And for exactly the reasons Gina outlined, the Board of Supervisors has advocated for years and years and years in Richmond for equal taxing authority, which was basically give us the same authorities as a county that all of the cities in Virginia have. Cities in Virginia have had meals taxes for years. Fairfax City, City of Alexandria, the list goes on and on and on. Almost every city in the Commonwealth of Virginia has it. Counties could not impose it by vote. They had to go to referendum. We asked simply give us the same rules as cities. The General Assembly in 2020 did that. So we now have the ability to impose the meals tax and a couple of other lesser sources of revenue by a vote of the Board of Supervisors. I think, without speaking for my colleagues, I think it was our intention to move forward on that. Obviously, the pandemic changed that. It wouldn't have made any sense for a lot of reasons to impose a tax on meals purchased at restaurants when restaurants were in the situation that they were in, when people weren't eating at restaurants anyway. So to answer Margaret's question, when do you want this new tax to be implemented? I don't have a preferred date at this point. For me, I'll continue to evaluate the economic situation, the situation that restaurants are in, the situation that the regional economy is in. What are the food items and circumstances to be subject to the tax? That's outlined in the legislation. It's pretty detailed. We could get it to you. Benefits to the county budget. I think, Joe, if I remember correctly, if we were to impose the full 4 cents pre-pandemic, we were estimating it could be $150 million?
No less than that, in the 110-20 range.
Okay,
but yeah, you're exactly right. That was pre-pandemic.
Okay,
So.
110 to $20 million. That was a pre-pandemic estimate. Obviously, if you did it today, it would be less, but maybe a year from now, it would be back up in that range. So we see that as a way to diversify the revenue source, quite frankly, in the context of the county's overall budget. And Joe outlined the total budget. $110 to $120 million isn't a huge amount, but we also have highlighted some of the challenges we have. Charles asked for a tax cut, which would have been about the equivalent of $110 to $120 million. Teacher pay of 5% would be in that range, so it would give us some additional flexibility. James writes, last week, the Northern Virginia Regional Commission hosted a presentation by S&P on climate resiliency and bond ratings. They noted that NOVA is a high E-risk, environment risk area. They also pointed out that there is a small but growing municipal green bond market. Given the counties, I think this should be counties, ambitious forward-looking environmental programs, would the county consider issuing a green bond and report to investors using the standards of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures or whatever new standards the SEC might issue? I will admit I'm not familiar with the concept of a green bond. We will check that out. One of the things I am very excited about is that one of our key legislative initiatives in Richmond this year was to gain the authority to create a local green bank to help finance local energy efficiency and renewable energy projects. And we had Fairfax delegate Kay Corey patron that legislation for us in the House of Delegates. We didn't expect to be successful in the first year, but we actually got it passed in the very first year. So we're going to be looking at a structure to do that hopefully will help private residents and businesses make investments in green infrastructure. We also are moving forward to create a resiliency plan for Fairfax County to look at what are the long-term fiscal impacts, capital improvement needs related to climate change. And Lake Accotink is a good example. Stronger storms means more stormwater flow. It means our lakes and streams fill up with silt and sediment faster and need to be maintained and dredged more often. We need to be looking long-term at what does that mean for our capital improvement planning, and we're working to do that. Joe, anything to add on this issue of environmental risk in your conversations with bond rating agencies? Is that something that they're beginning to ask about, something that they're beginning to think about?
So I think I would answer that in a couple of different ways. Certainly, the combination of the financial impact of expensive priorities like our environmental programs, like affordable housing, I think are where the main focus is. I think we have decades worth of history with the rating agencies in making the decisions to balance the need to advance programs and the impact on our budget. I think that the reality of the AAA, as you mentioned, and the flexibility that it gives us in terms of being able to access, whether it's the state bonds that we're using for the Acatink, whether it's the as inexpensive as they get GO bonds that we issue, we have the ability and the flexibility to use tools that are the most appropriate for the programs and the projects. And if green bonds in the future are one of the items that we need to add to that list of tools, we certainly will do so. But I think that the fundamental challenge will be the support of those bonds, the debt payment of those bonds, debt repayment of those bonds comes from the same pot of money that we're funding teacher pay, other programs with, and so that balance needs to be clearly addressed as part of the board's deliberations. And again, we have decades worth of proof that the Fairfax board does that.
Okay, we've had a question that's come in by email. Brian, you want to give us the email question?
Of course. So this one comes in from David, and David says, Supervisor Walkinshaw, I am on the board of directors of the Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions. We in the Alliance want to commend the Board of Supervisors for having the foresight to develop a plan to harden our county's infrastructure against the probability of future climate disasters. We only have to look at the recent example of the Texas energy grid to see where we do not want to be. I am concerned that while the county has wisely allocated funds to prepare a climate resiliency plan, it has not yet established funding for the many projects that will certainly be coming forward from this plan. Supervisor Walkinshaw, how will the board ensure that the county establishes reliable county, state, and federal funding sources for strengthening our county's infrastructure?
It's a great question, David. Thank you. I think we kind of touched on it, but I think, and Joe, correct me if this is wrong, there may be a small kind of independent set aside or carryover amount for implementation, but really in terms of the resiliency plan, what it will give us is a tool to incorporate into the CIP, the capital improvement program, for every county project. So if we're looking at funding a project that's maybe could be subject to flooding, or a road or a bridge project, we can, with the resiliency plan, look at the funding for that project and say, we need to do a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that. It's not so much a discrete funding source, but it's really integrating resiliency into everything that we're planning.
I think that's exactly right, and I think that, again, consistent with what you've just said, it provides us the opportunity to identify whether it's a stormwater fund initiative that needs to be addressed, whether it's a wastewater bond fund that needs to be addressed, whether it's general fund dollars, whether it's long-term debt. And so, yes, absolutely, it provides us with, I think, a much better footing relative to making those decisions about identifying what the bundle of funding sources looks like.
Great. We have a schools question here. Kathleen writes in, will the budget include a raise for our hardworking teachers? I think we've addressed that. Hopefully we've done the best that we can to answer that question, Kathleen. Second question, Kathleen asks, will the Board of Supervisors hold the school board and public school system responsible if they are not open for full-time in-person learning as promised in fall 2021? And I can try to address this we have a very important relationship between the Board of Supervisors and the school board, and it is very important that we communicate and collaborate with one another, and Megan and I do that regularly, and the two boards do as a whole. But the people that hold the school system responsible are the same people that hold me responsible, and that's the voters of Fairfax County. They are directly elected independently of us, and they engage directly with their constituents just like they do. So it's not a relationship where we hold them responsible or we tell them what to do. Obviously, we have an important dialogue every year about the budget and about the needs of the school system and about the things that we both think should be priorities. And I know that both boards believe that continuing to reopen and expand in-person learning is a priority. I'll ask Kathleen's third question, and then we'll go to you, Megan, to respond. She also asks, does the Board of Supervisors and School Board realize that many families are looking for FCPS to provide 4 days of in-person instructions for families who selected in-person as proof they will offer 5 days safely in the fall? Megan, do you want to respond to Kathleen's questions there?
Yes, thanks, James. I think that two of those are extremely important. The first one I want to share with Kathleen and the listeners is that while James was being extremely diplomatic, I have shared with him that because the Board of Supervisors and therefore our county residents provide almost 75% or more of our annual operating funds, they do have the right to hold our school board and the school system accountable from a financial standpoint. And while there is such a strong relationship and there is the recognition of where our decision-making authorities lie, I do take very seriously that if our board, if the school system, as a 25-year resident myself and a taxpayer to our public schools, if we're not on the school board or the superintendent operating efficiently and effectively, I would welcome and want to have the county executive and the Board of Supervisors to weigh in on that. I will say that to date, as I noted earlier in the conversation, I'm very, very encouraged that with strong voices coming from many of my colleagues and I talking with the superintendent just in the past few days, that we need to match Loudoun County, which is set to provide 4 days of in-person learning starting April 20th. That is my continual message to the superintendent. And I do believe he is working extremely hard and recognizes to what Kathleen said, that if we're going to be fully operating and open for in-person learning in the fall, 5 days a week, nothing is more important than demonstrating our capacity and ability to deliver on that now in this fourth quarter. So I do want to reassure Kathleen and others who are listening, that is absolutely our goal and our effort, and expect the superintendent will be sending more details out to our families and our employees in on that. So really want to thank you again, James, in particular. I know you have been such a partner with me, especially during the pandemic, as we've talked about the challenges the schools are facing. And just want to encourage all families who are listening, if you have any concerns at all about the schools, things that are being said to you that are concerning, please reach out to me right away so that I and my staff assistant, Donna, can get those questions and concerns addressed as soon as possible. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We have another question that's come in by email. Brian, you want to give us the email question?
Yep, this one came in from Tim, and Tim asks, why keep adding new employees to the budget? Why not taking care of your existing employees? Why not use funding proposed for new employees, except for healthcare, as a one-time bonus for existing workers and delay 1 year newly proposed employees?
So I'll let Joe talk about that, but I think in terms of new employees in this budget, one, we're talking about a small number of positions in the health department because we recognize that the pandemic exposed some gaps in our public health efforts that are going to be important in our continued response to COVID and other public health issues that come up. And then additional long-planned staffing for police and fire stations that are newly opening.
Absolutely. I think that the balance that the board has struck in terms of identifying as a priority staffing for facilities that will be constructed and ready to open, as opposed to having them constructed and sit vacant because the staffing is not in place, has been one that they've reaffirmed over and over. In addition to the list of positions that Supervisor Walkinshaw mentioned, I would also point out that there are some positions that are included as part of the recommendation that are not funded with general fund dollars. They're funded with other sources, and so they're not competing with the same priorities. And those new facilities go beyond just public safety. The public safety police station and fire station that I mentioned, we do have community centers in Sully and Lee that are opening that are also funded, at least in part, as part of this budget for the same reason, recognizing that if the facilities are there, the community needs to have access to them.
Yeah. So I think the point is the taxpayers have paid for the buildings, tens of millions of dollars, and at this point, we don't think it would be a wise choice to leave those buildings vacant for a year in the hopes that next year will be a better budget situation, because we don't know that. So I think the taxpayers would correctly be asking a lot of questions as to why we're leaving police stations, fire stations, and community centers vacant. I also think it's accurate that the small number of new positions for those facilities, even if we were to eliminate them, would not allow us to do very much by way of pay raises or pay increases for the thousands and thousands of county and school employees that we have.
That's correct.
Yeah. So we have reached the end of our time, and unfortunately I wasn't able to get to a few of the questions that came in, but I want to thank you all for your great questions. I want to thank our guests, Fairfax County CFO Joe Mondoro and Braddock District School Board member Megan McLaughlin for joining us today. I apologize we didn't get to all of the submitted questions, but the Braddock District team and I will be working hard over the next couple days to make sure we answer you directly. As we close tonight, please remember to check the Health Department's website regularly and text FFX COVID to 888-777 to receive regular text message alerts regarding COVID-19 and the vaccine. Thank you, and have a good night.